More than 100 years ago, in 1924, Thomas Mann published a mammoth of a book of German literature that became somewhat of an instant classic, The Magic Mountain. It took him 12 years to write it, but it was worth it because it amassed a loyal readership from day one. I am one of those people that loves The Magic Mountain because it has everything. This book discusses illness, ideology, progress, literature, art, music, politics, science, time, love, war, peace, psychoanalysis, and religion. This book truly has it all. Susan Sontag said that this novel was Thomas Mann's attempt to depict the sum of all the problems that were present in pre-war Europe in the early 1900s. And in true Thomas Mann style, this novel poses many questions without giving us a lot of answers. Thomas Mann was a fabulous novelist. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929 for his book Buddenbrooks, which he wrote 24 years before The Magic Mountain. But a lot of people say that it was actually The Magic Mountain that convinced the jury to give him the prize. And as my professor convinced me to read it by saying, "Don't worry, it's not very difficult, it's just a very long book," I want to convince you today to give this book a try by giving you 5 tips on how to read this brick. So we'll talk all about translation, how to understand Thomas Mann's irony, the aspect of time in the novel, and the characters. And I'll of course read you some of the parts in English as well as in German, so you get a feel for the language. And this is a very special video for me to make because it's actually my 1-year anniversary since finishing The Magic Mountain for the first time. I heard about it in my first semester of studying literature, and when our professor had us read some parts of the text as homework, I printed out some quotes. I still remember where I was sitting when I was reading the first lines of this book. And I sat in a cafe and I started reading it, and I immediately realized how much I love it. So I went straight to the bookstore and bought it and continued reading it then. It was only a few months later that I had enough time to actually read it front to back when I did a very intense therapy for an entire month, and this was the only book that I brought. So needless to say, it holds a very special place in my heart. So it is for that reason that I chose this book to be the first ever book club that I'm hosting, and you're warmly invited if you want to join me on the journey of reading this book together. So how this is gonna work is that this video that you're watching right now should be your introduction, considered your invitation to go out and buy the book and commit to reading it over the next 2 months with me and everyone else who decides to join. And then the comment section of this video can be used as the discussion place, and I will also over the next couple of months post a few updates on my community page. And then to wrap the book club up, I'm gonna film another video 2 months from now where I'm gonna talk about my experience reading the book again, but mostly I want to give you the stage to talk about what it was like to read that book. So if you want to and you've read this book or you're planning to read it now, please feel free to send me an email with your experience and your thoughts, why you loved it, how it has made you grow, and I'll compile all of the best bits into one video so we can hear from each other. This is the first time I'm trying out a book club for free on YouTube, so let's see how it works. And please, if you have anything to say about this book, if you have been touched in any way, until May 10th, send me your experience. I always have my email address linked in the description box. I'll of course keep you anonymous if you don't want to have your name mentioned. So if you've always wanted to read The Magic Mountain and you never dared to, consider this your invitation. So let's get into some background information about this book. Thomas Mann was an extremely disciplined writer. He wrote from 8 to 12 in the morning every day, writing left to right. And as I said in the beginning, it took him 12 years to write this novel. He lived from 1875 until 1955, which means that he lived through both world wars. He was homosexual, but he didn't want to admit that to himself. So there's a lot of sublimation going on in his novel, meaning that he took that drive, that desire, and channeled it into his writing. So there are a lot of homoerotic elements in most of his novels. In his real life, he was married to a woman named Katja, and they had 6 children together. And we know that he felt a lot of guilt for his sexuality and he didn't want her to find out. So he had arranged it that after his death, his diaries would be kept shut for at least 20 years before anyone got to read them, hoping that by doing that, Katja would never find out. So in 1913, his wife, Katja, actually went to a sanatorium in the Swiss mountains for 6 months. That is also the place where this novel takes place. Thomas Mann visited her there for 3 weeks. So, if you know what the book is about, I'll talk about it in a moment. You can see the connection that this place has inspired Thomas Mann to write this novel, right? It's set in a Swiss sanatorium as well. A sanatorium is somewhat of a mix between a hotel and a hospital, where people with lung problems went so they could breathe the fresh mountain air because it would make them better, basically. And people stayed for different amounts of time. And the sanatorium in this book is very luxurious, right? It's people with a lot of money that can go there. And every room in this sanatorium building has a balcony, which is where the Liegekur, the horizontal way of life, as Thomas Mann calls it, is taking place every day. So the idea is that you lay outside, no matter how cold it is, you're wrapped in a bunch of blankets, and you just breathe the air. So again, that's where he conceived of this idea. He met actual patients and doctors, so all of the people in his novel are inspired by real characters. And Davos, the city in Switzerland where this is playing, also exists in reality. The sanatorium Berghof doesn't exist, but it's modeled after the one that he visited. And what I found very funny is that after this book was published, the people of Davos complained that Thomas Mann was painting their town in a really bad light, which I find hilarious. I don't think that's the case. So, what is this story about? In a few strokes, we follow Hans Castorp. He's a young man, and we learn that he's an orphan. He's lost his parents very early on and then was raised by his grandfather, who also passed away. And he's just getting into adulthood. And so we meet him at the beginning of his journey to Davos. He goes there to visit his cousin, Joachim, who suffers from tuberculosis. And Hans Castorp just wants to stay for 3 weeks visiting his cousin because, he wants to go back to his real life and become a shipbuilder. But then just before the 3 weeks are up, he gets a fever and he's kind of not feeling so good, and then he's stuck there. I mean, that's a little bit the question, is like, is he really sick? What's going on? And basically he ends up staying there for 7 years. So what should have been a 3-week vacation are the 7 years that he's staying at that sanatorium. And the book is about those 7 years. Up there, he obviously spends time with his cousin, Joachim. He's a very important character. But there's also a woman he kind of becomes obsessed with, Claudio Shusha, so that's a little bit of a storyline as well. And then there are 2 men, Settembrini and Nafta, who we'll get to later. They're older than him and they constantly talk to him, and they're in a sort of ideological battle with each other at all times, and they're trying to convince Hans Castorp. There's really not that much going on plot-wise, as you can imagine. It's just a sanatorium. They're not supposed to go on hikes or anything. They're really just staying inside, having the same routine every day. So it's not a very plot-heavy novel by any means. The beauty of this novel is really in the interactions that the people have and the beautiful and vivid descriptions of the characters that Thomas Mann gives us. So let's get into the 5 points that I think are important when reading this novel. Number 1, understanding Thomas Mann's irony and his impartiality. So what you might not expect from this novel is that it is hilarious. Thomas Mann has a kind of humor that is very subtle and very macabre at the same time, and I rarely went 10 pages without laughing out loud. It's this constant underlying stream of irony, and I'll read you just the foreword in a moment so you get an idea of that. But the irony comes from the fact that Thomas Mann brings up a lot of positions in this book without ever really choosing a side. It feels like he's a little bit making fun of everyone. He loves double meaning. And again, what makes Thomas Mann's writing so special is that he suggests so many things, but he does so in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. So the reader never really knows what Mann's position really is, or what the core message of the book is supposed to be. In reading, we never get to a point of saying, oh, this is what he wanted to tell us. So Thomas Mann is simultaneously in all of his characters and in none of them. And it gives this really interesting tension that just makes you laugh very often. I'll read you the foreword now, because I think it shows both that side, the irony, the funny bit, and also how beautifully Thomas Mann writes. The story of Hans Castorp that we intend to tell here, not for his sake, for the reader will come to know him as a perfectly ordinary, if engaging young man, but for the sake of the story itself, which seems to us to be very much worth telling, although in Hans Castorp's favor it should be noted that it is his story, and that not every story happens to everybody. It's a story that took place long ago, and is, so to speak, covered with the patina of history. It must necessarily be told with verbs whose tense is that of the deepest past. Nor is that detrimental to our story. Indeed, it may well work to its advantage, for stories as histories must be past, and the further past, one might say, the better for them as stories and for the storyteller, that conjurer who murmurs in past tenses. But the problem with our story, as also with many people nowadays, and indeed not the least with those who tell stories, is this. It is much older than its years. Its datedness is not to be measured in days, nor the burden of age weighing upon to be counted by orbits around the sun. In a word, it does not actually owe its pastness to time, an assertion that is itself intended as a passing reference, an allusion to the problematic and uniquely double nature of that mysterious element. The second point that I think is important to understand is that this novel could be called an Anti-Bildungsroman. So, what is a Bildungsroman? It's a German word. Bildung means education and Roman means novel. So usually novels like that deal with the formative years of a person, the people he or she gets to know, and that help that character in their personal development towards adulthood. A couple of examples for Bildungsromans are Great Expectations by Charles Dickens or Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. So even though in The Magic Mountain the setup is kind of the same, we also have a young man in his formative years. Hans Castorp doesn't really learn. He listens to everything that is told to him. He pays attention, but that doesn't translate to any productivity on his part. The insights do not stay. And you can observe that all throughout the novel, but most notably maybe in the chapter Snow, which is arguably the high point of the novel. So what happens in the chapter Snow is that Hans Castorp, after being at the sanatorium for a couple of years already, he decides he wants to go into the snow. He wants to take a little tour, which is of course very dangerous because he's not well prepared. He hasn't done it in a long time, if ever. He goes alone. I think it's already a little bit too late in the day to start. There were of course no such things as electronic gadgets for avalanches or to contact anyone in case you get stuck somewhere. Like if you grew up in a country where there's snow, you know that it can be really dangerous and you shouldn't do that. But he does it anyway, and lo and behold, he does get stuck. And it's very uncomfortable to read. There's snow falling, it's getting kind of dark and gray, and he loses his orientation. And he ends up falling asleep. He leans against a little shed and falls asleep, which is another thing you really shouldn't do. It's very dangerous. In that little sleep, however, he has two important dreams. The first one is about Greece and a society where beauty, art, and togetherness are central. He kind of sees it as the ideal, as how people are supposed to live. And then the other dream is not so visual, it's more verbal and insight-based. And that dream gives him one insight that, again, could be said to be the most important point of the book. And that is, for the sake of goodness and love, man shall grant death no domination over his thoughts. So that is the only sentence that is written in italics in the entire book. And it's that idea that, of course, we should have an awareness of death and live with death. But if we let that have domination over our thoughts, that cannot lead to a good life, right? For the sake of goodness and love, man shall grant death no domination over his thoughts. Very much more beautiful in German. Der Mensch soll der Güte und Liebe willen dem Tod keine Herrschaft einräumen über seine Gedanken. Okay, so tying all of that together to what I was saying about it not being a Bildungsroman, is that he has that insight, and what happens is he wakes up again from this dream, and actually he wasn't asleep for very long. It seemed to only take a couple of minutes, and he can see again, and he can quite easily get down the mountain again, and everything is fine. And then it says that his dream was already beginning to fade, and by bedtime he was no longer exactly sure what his thoughts had been. So basically he forgets his great insight again on the next page. Or is it forgotten? You know, I mean, we could argue, I think it was Jorge Luis Borges who said that forgetting might be the most profound way of remembering. So maybe it is still there somewhere in Hans Castorp, but I don't think so. But what's funny about this situation is that we as the reader, we don't have to forget. We literally go back one page and we can read it, and we can read it over and over again. Right, which is the beauty of the medium of writing. But anyways, Hans Castorp's unwillingness, let's maybe call it, to get into action or to learn or to implement things are what makes this like an ironic Bildungsroman. And the fact is also that he's constantly caught in the middle of a bunch of opinions, which really is, if you think about it, the fate of modern man as well. Just as Hans Castorp is bombarded with ideas about humanism and science and religion and psychoanalysis that was coming up at the time and new inventions, so are we nowadays, trapped within a web of information, unable to make a move at times. So this is what makes this novel deeply modern. And by modern, I mean the literary time period of modernism. You know, other modern writers are Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, and their novels usually are about outside figures trying to grapple with the complexities of life. So I would say, while reading it, see how you can connect that to your own life and to your own situation today, because I would argue it's very similar. I mean, it's very similar for me. It becomes harder and harder to choose a path, and it's becoming easier and easier to be swamped by information and opinions. The third thing I wanted to make you aware of is that this novel is a novel about time. And it is about time in three different ways. It is a novel that is about its time, Europe before the First World War. It is also a novel that has time as a topic. And then it is a novel that simulates time and how we experience time. So let me explain. Firstly, it is a novel about its time. So a fictional document, if you will, trying to capture the time before the First World War And even though we're in a mountain sanatorium, so removed from the world, we can still feel the tension in the air. Symbolically, that tension is carried out between Settembrini and Nafta, embodying two different ways of viewing the world. We'll get into that in a little bit. And it's beautiful because Thomas Mann basically asks the question all the way at the end of the novel, whether love will win, so the last extremely beautiful sentence of this novel is, "And out of this worldwide festival of death, this ugly rutting fever that inflames the rainy evening sky all round, will love someday rise up out of this too?" So that's the question, right? History, it's time. Will we get out on top? And unfortunately for Thomas Mann at this time, he has no ideas about the horrors to come yet. Secondly, as I said, it is a novel that has time as its topic. Time and what it is as a concept is regularly discussed between the characters in this book. And Thomas Mann was possibly influenced by Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Wagner at his time. And just to give you a little bit of a taste, I'll read you a bit from where Joachim, Hans's cousin, has to measure his fever with an old fever thermometer that you have to keep in your mouth for 7 minutes, right? It's not a digital one, obviously. It's one with, quicksilver in there. And he has to keep it in for 7 minutes and then read his temperature. And Hans Castorp discusses how absurd it is that we measure time with space, right? So we measure time on a clock in a spatial way. 7 minutes must be up by now. Joachim shook his head. After a while, he took the thermometer out of his mouth, looked at it, and said, "Yes, when you pay close attention to it, time, it goes very slowly. I truly like measuring my temperature 4 times a day, because it makes you notice what 1 minute, or even 7, actually means. Especially since the 7 days of a week hang so dreadfully heavy on your hands here." "You said actually, but actually doesn't apply," Hans Castorp responded. He was sitting with one thigh hiked up on the railing. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot. "There's nothing actual about time. If it seems long to you, then it is long. And if it seems to pass quickly, then it's short. But how long or how short it is in actuality, no one knows." He was not at all used to philosophizing, and yet felt some urge to do so. Joachim contested this. "Why is that? No, we do measure it. We've clocks and calendars, and when a month has passed, then it's passed. For you and me and everyone." "But wait," Hans Castorp said, holding up a forefinger next to one bloodshot eye. "You said that a minute is as long as it seems to you while you're measuring your temperature, correct?" "A minute is as long as... It lasts as long as it takes a second hand to complete a circle. But how long that takes can vary greatly, according to how we feel it. And in point of fact, I repeat, in point of fact," Hans Castorp said, pressing his forefinger so firmly against his nose that its tip was folded to one side. "That's a matter of motion in space, correct? Wait, hear me out. And so we measure time with space. But that is the same thing as trying to measure space with time, the way uneducated people do. It's 20 hours from Hamburg to Davos. True, by train. But on foot? How far is it then? And in our minds? Not even a second." "Listen here," Joachim said. "What's wrong with you? I think being up here with us is getting to you." Thirdly, it is a novel that lets us feel time. Not just because the book is long and it takes a long time to read it, right? The English edition, I think, has 850 pages. It's more nuanced than that. We're actually feeling with Hans Castorp as we're reading how time expands and contracts according to what is happening in our life. Thomas Mann, through this novel, asserts that when something new and different is happening in our life, time slows down. We notice everything in great detail. Our senses are heightened. Time is only notable or most notable when something changes. So when Hans Castorp in the beginning of the book arrives at Berghof Sanatorium, that's exactly what happens. Everything is new, and Mann describes in great detail what is happening. The first 3 chapters out of the 7, that's 120 pages, are only about the first 2 days up there. The next chapter, chapter 4, is about the first 3 weeks, and halfway through the book, Hans Castorp is at the sanatorium for 7 months. Remember how the entire timeline is 7 years, so later, especially in the second half of the book, time is getting lost in somewhat of a soup of eternity. There's not really a lot to hold on to anymore, there's not a lot of new things happening, and I think this is an attempt to make us aware of our perception of time when we get used to something. And that's the beauty of this book. You know, Thomas Mann doesn't tell us that. I mean, he tells us a little bit a few times, but mostly he just shows us. Here's how he would describe it. Emptiness and monotony may stretch a moment or even an hour and make it boring, but they can likewise abbreviate and dissolve large, indeed the largest units of time, until they seem nothing at all. Conversely, rich and interesting events are capable of filling time, until hours, even days, are shortened and speed past on wings, whereas on a larger scale, interest leads the passage of time, breadth, solidity, and weight, so that years rich in events pass much more slowly than do paltry, bare, fewer-weight years that are blown before the wind and are gone. What people call boredom is actually an abnormal compression of time caused by monotony. Uninterrupted uniformity can shrink large spaces of time until the heart falters, terrified to death. When one day is like every other, then all days are like one, and perfect homogeneity would make the longest life seem very short, as if it had flown by in a twinkling. Habit arises when our sense of time falls asleep, or at least grows dull, and if the years of youth are experienced slowly, while the later years of life hurtle past at an ever-increasing speed, it must be habit that causes it. And just to round this point up, some people have actually put the notable events of this book into a chart. Or is that a graph? I think it's a graph, where the time is on the x-axis and the number of years passed on the y-axis. And basically the point I'm trying to make is that there's an exponential divergence between the time something takes and the time it takes to tell it. So in conclusion, this novel simulates our experience of time. It doesn't just depict it. And I find that so beautiful that literature can do that, that it can give us such a clear sense of something that might be more difficult to explain through other sciences. 4th point, let's talk about the characters, because this is what gave me the most pain when I was reading The Magic Mountain for the first time. There are not a lot of characters, so that's not the problem, that you have to keep track of them or anything, but understanding the discussions in the book between Settembrini and Nafta, those 2 men that are constantly arguing with each other, that was hard for me to understand. They are Hans's biggest influence, and they're always trying to convince him to choose their side. And let me just be clear up front that a lot of that went over my head, and I just kept reading anyways, and I still had a wonderful experience with this book. So if there's passages you don't understand, it's fine, just keep going. I don't think you should get stuck on that on your first read, but to understand this dynamic better, here's what helped me. So apparently the title for The Magic Mountain came from a work by Nietzsche that is called The Birth of Tragedy. And in it, Nietzsche talks about two Greek gods that oppose each other and thereby complement each other. The first one being Apollo, the god of reason and science, and the other one being Dionysius, the god of emotions and art. And you'll find how all throughout this book there are these clashes of opposites that really don't seem to get along so well, but they kind of attract each other and need each other, right? And isn't that what we experience so often in our life as well? Settembrini, the Italian, he really embodies humanistic ideals and enlightenment, whereas Nafta more stands in for traditions and religion and totalitarianism, I would say. So through these individuals, we're learning about the dominant ways of thinking at the time. And it's really these many voices that are coming together that make this book, I think. Another one such opposite is that Hans Castorp is very heady, right? He's very analytical, we could say. But then he really feels attracted to Claudia Chauchat. Yeah, she's the romantic ideal, showing us that art and reason always have to come together. And Chauchat is an interesting character. I think she's so well drawn. Like, there's something incredibly sensual and erotic about her descriptions of how she is walking and how she puts like her hand on the back of her head. It's so subtle and so wonderful. I think you'll really enjoy it. And what's interesting as well is that Hans Castorp feels so attracted to her, and she reminds him of a boy that went to school with him, Chibislav. So there's the question whether Hans Castorp felt attracted to that boy when he was young, and how that attraction now jumps over from a man to a woman. That entire thing I talked about in the beginning with Thomas Mann's sexuality, you can see that fluidity happening here. Here's Hans Castorp seeing Claudia Chauchat. It was Madame Chauchat, he realized with something like indignation. What a hell of a thing to have happened. Wasn't he ever going to be able to calm down? He had thought that, having arrived at his goal, he could sit there quietly and recover a little, and now he had to have her right in front of his nose. A coincidence that might possibly have pleased him under other circumstances, but what good did it do him in his weary, frazzled state? It only made new demands of his heart, and he would be preoccupied and tense all through the lecture. She had looked at him with eyes exactly like Přibyslav, staring into his face and at the bloodstains. A rather impolite, brazen stare, by the way, that matched the manners of a woman who slammed doors. What awful posture she had! Not like the woman in Hans Castorp's social circle at home, who sat straight backed at the table and turned only their heads to speak with pursed lips to gentlemen on either side. Frau Chauchat sat in a limp slouch, her back rounded, her shoulders drooping forward, and at the same time she thrust her head out so that her neck bones were visibly above the collar line of her white blouse. Přibyslav had held his head like that too, but he had been a model student and led a life full of honors, although that had not been the reason why Hans Castorp had borrowed a pencil from him. Whereas it was all too clear from Frau Chauchat's careless posture, her door slamming, and her brazen stares were bound up with her illness, that in fact they were all expressions of that same license young Herr Albin had praised the advantages of which, if not honorable, were at least almost endless. So again, look for these opposites in the novel. They're everywhere. As I said, in the Snow chapter, for example, he gets so confronted with life and death at the same time, and it's beautiful, I think, because again we're in the middle as readers, and it could be even said that all of these character traits are part of one human, right? Ratio and feeling, socialism, religion, humanism, all that lives inside of us in some way. Lastly, let's talk about translations. There are two main translations into English available. the one being the H.T. Lower Porter translation, and the other one is by John E. Woods, that is more recent. Now, Thomas Mann personally approved of the Lower Porter translation, which came out in 1925, the year after The Magic Mountain was published, which is incredibly quick, by the way, and is emblematic of the success of this novel. But I wholeheartedly recommend you to get the John E. Woods translation. I have it here in the Everyman Library edition. It's a beautiful book. And the reason why I say that is because I did a little bit of comparing, and Lower Porter often really translates word for word, which just sounds very weird and makes it so that the reading is not very fluent. It just doesn't work very well. I have looked up a sentence in both translations, so I'm going to read you the German original first, then the Lower Porter translation, and then the Woods one, and you can make your own judgment. Here's the sentence in German. Denn es war ja nun schon das 3. Mal binnen so kurzer Zeit und bei so jungen Jahren, dass der Tod auf den Geist und die Sinne, namentlich auch auf die Sinne, des kleinen Hans Castorp wirkte. Neu war ihm der Anblick und Eindruck nicht mehr, sondern bereits recht vertraut. Lower Porter's translation of that part. Thus, for the 3rd time in so short a space, and in such young years, did death play upon the spirit and senses, but chiefly of the senses, of the lad. The sight was no longer strange, it was already right familiar. John E. Woods. For this was now the 3rd time within a few months, and at such a young age, that little Hans Castorp's mind and senses had been affected by death, his senses in particular. The sight of it, the impression it left, was no longer new to him, but really quite familiar. Now, there are still some little misunderstandings of Germans in this Woods translation, but it is far superior to the Lower Porter one, in my opinion. Also, in this edition, again the Everyman Library one that I have, the part where Hans Castorp and Claudia Chauchat speak French with each other is just in English, right? I checked and it's in italic, so you can see that it's supposed to be in French, but it is just in English, and I think that's very, I don't know, it just makes it, again, more accessible. Oh my god, by the way, in that part where Hans Castorp talks French to Claudia Chauchat, he references a Walt Whitman poem in French, I Sing the Body Electric. That's like a little fun Easter egg to hand out. And of course, to end this point on translation, if you can, read the German, right? It's gonna take you a little longer though. This is 1,100 pages, even though the English one is only 850. I've talked before about the fact that German just has a longer internal grammatical structure than English, but it is of course so worth it. And it's just one of these books that makes me really, really happy that I can speak German. Okay, let me give you a few last recommendations. And then I'll read you a little quote to end with, both in English and in German. So there is a YouTube channel called Thomas Mann Project, and I think it's dedicated solely to deep reading The Magic Mountain. I don't know this man's name, but he makes extremely in-depth videos. I'm talking 45-minute long videos about just a few pages on every chapter. And what is additionally impressive is that he uploads them in German, in English, and in Italian. So if you speak any one of those languages and you're getting stuck on some point, I think it is worth to check out his analyses. I'm gonna link the English playlist for the Magic Mountain read-through below. And then there's also a movie, a 1981 movie, directed by Hans W. Geisendörfer, Der Zauberberg. It is in German and it is available on YouTube, and it unfortunately doesn't have any English subtitles. So if you speak German, you can watch it without a problem. If you speak English, I think you can still watch it if you know what it is about, or just click through a little bit to get a feeling, because I think it is very well done. It's very well translated into film. And it's just so lovely to have a visual component of, what medicine was like back then. Again, I think it's very well done. Just make sure you decide on whether you want the characters to form in your own head first or whether you want to see that movie, because I had to watch that movie for uni, and in my head Hans Castorp and Joachim and Settembrini, they just look exactly like those actors now, and I'm never going to be able to change that again. And of course, last recommendation, join the book club. Take this as your sign to read The Magic Mountain now. Leave us a comment down below, send me an email with your experience, and check the community page for some updates. Okay, to close us out, I'm going to read a quote, page 12 in the English translation, page 4 in the German. Oh no, the other way around. Page 4 in the English translation. It is when Hans Castorp is just traveling to Davos. Quote, 2 days of travel separate this young man, and young he is, with few firm roots in life, from his everyday world, especially from what he called his duties, interests, worries, and prospects, separate him far more than he had dreamed possible as he rode to the station in a hansom cab. Space, as it rolls and tumbles away between him and his native soil, proves to have powers normally ascribed only to time. From hour to hour, space brings about changes very like those time produces, yet surpassing them in certain ways. Space, like time, gives birth to forgetfulness, but does so by removing an individual from all relationships and placing him in a free and pristine state. Indeed, in but a moment, it can turn a pedant and Philistine into something like a vagabond. Time, they say, is water from the river Lethe, but alien air is a similar drink, and if its effects are less profound, it works all the more quickly. 2 Reisetage entfernen dem Menschen und gar den jungen, im Leben noch wenig festwurzelnden Menschen seiner Alltagswelt, all dem, was seine Pflichten, Interessen, Sorgen, Aussichten nannte, viel mehr, als es sich auf der Droschkenfahrt zum Bahnhof wohl träumen ließ. Der Raum, der sich drehend und fliehend zwischen ihn und seine Pflanzstätte wälzt, bewährte Kräfte, die man gewöhnlich der Zeit vorbehalten glaubt. Von Stunde zu Stunde stellt er innere Veränderungen her, die den von ihr bewirkten sehr ähnlich sind, aber sie in gewisser Weise übertreffen. Gleich ihr erzeugt er Vergessen. Er tut es aber, indem er die Person des Menschen aus ihren Beziehungen löst und ihn in einen freien und ursprünglichen Zustand versetzt. Ja, selbst aus dem Pedanten und Pfahlbürger macht er im Handumdrehen etwas wie einen Vagabunden. Zeit, sagt man, ist Lethe, aber auch Fernlust ist so ein Trank, und sollte sie weniger gründlich wirken, so tut sie es dafür desto rascher. I sing the body electric, baby. I sing my body electric.